A heavy silence. A room full of Chicago's elite, suddenly paralyzed. And a waitress, her finger pointed inches from the face of the most feared man in the North Side. Everyone at the Gilded Lily knew who he was. Arturo Panicucci. The king. The ghost. A man who didn't just break rules, he broke people. But this time? The girl in the stained vest didn't flinch. She didn't beg for her job. She leaned into his space, and whispered 7 words that should have been her death warrant. "Touch me again, and I'll break you." The bodyguards reached for their holsters. The room waited for the blood to hit the marble. But what the Mafia boss did next, no one in that room saw coming. The Gilded Lily wasn't just a lounge. It was a sanctuary for the powerful, where secrets were traded over $100 pours of scotch. And tonight? That sanctuary was about to become a war zone. Ruby C. Adams had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her back ached. The final notice for her grandmother's community center was burning a hole in her pocket. And the bank was only 48 hours away from tearing it all down. She was supposed to be invisible. A ghost in a white shirt and black vest. But then, the heavy oak doors swung open. Arturo Panicucci. A man who didn't just walk into a room, he occupied it. He was the kind of shadow that made the city's lights feel dim. When he sat at table 1, the energy in the lounge curdled. It wasn't just respect. It was a cold, suffocating weight. Like the oxygen itself was being sucked out of the room. He snapped his fingers, a sound like a whip crack. And when Ruby didn't move fast enough, when his hand clamped around her wrist, that's when the girl with nothing left to lose finally snapped back. The dawn over the south side of Chicago didn't break with a golden glow. It arrived in shades of bruised purple and charcoal gray, filtered through the rusted tracks of the L train. Ruby C. Adams stood at her kitchen window, the rhythmic screech of the morning commute acting as a metronome for her anxiety. In her hand, the paper felt heavier than the lead pipes in her crumbling apartment. It was the 3rd, final notice, from the city, stamped with a bold, red seal that seemed to bleed into the cheap laminate of her counter. The Genesis Community Center wasn't just a building of brick and mortar, it was the heartbeat of a neighborhood that the rest of the city had tried to forget. It was where her grandmother, Nana Rose, had taught 3 generations of kids that their zip code wasn't their destiny. But now, a predatory land developer named Senator Sterling had his sights set on the block. To him, the center was an eyesore to be leveled for luxury condos. To Ruby, it was the only thing keeping the streets from swallowing the local youth whole. "You're scowling at that paper again, Ruby girl." Nana Rose's voice was thin but steady as she shuffled into the kitchen, the scent of lavender and peppermint following her. Ruby quickly folded the notice, shoving it into her pocket. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were underlined by the dark circles of a double-shift worker. "Just a bill, Nana. Nothing I can't handle." Handling it meant 60 hours a week at the Gilded Lily, a place where the floor wax cost more than her monthly rent. It meant smiling at men who looked through her like she was made of glass and swallowing her pride until it felt like a stone in her throat. Her bank account was a graveyard of zeros, and the property taxes were a mountain she was trying to climb with broken fingernails. As she pulled on her crisp white shirt and adjusted the black vest, Ruby looked at herself in the cracked hallway mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who was tired, yes, but also a woman who was dangerous. Desperation had stripped away her fear, leaving behind a cold, sharp edge. She didn't just need money, she needed a miracle, or a fight. She kissed Nana's cheek and headed for the door, the weight of the south side settling onto her shoulders like a suit of armor. She didn't know that tonight, at table 1, the world would finally push back, and for the first time in her life, she was going to push back harder. The bus ride toward the glowing lights of the north side felt like a descent into enemy territory, but as Ruby gripped the handrail, her knuckles white, she knew one thing for certain: she would break before she let them take the only home she had left. The adrenaline that had sustained Ruby during her confrontation with Arturo Panicucci evaporated the moment she stepped out of the Gilded Lily. The Chicago night air was biting, cutting through her thin uniform as she walked toward the bus stop, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had survived the encounter, but she was certain she had just traded her future for 10 seconds of pride. A black sedan, sleek and predatory as a shark, pulled up to the curb beside her. The window rolled down with a mechanical hum, revealing the sharp, calculated features of the man who had occupied her every thought for the last 4 hours. "Get in, Ruby C. Adams," Arturo said. It wasn't a request. Ruby hesitated, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "I told you what would happen if you touched me again." A ghost of a smirk pulled at Arturo's mouth. "And I'm not touching you. I'm offering you a ride. And a way to burn that final notice in your pocket." The mention of the debt froze her. She climbed into the leather-scented warmth of the back seat, the door closing with a heavy thud that felt like a gavel. Arturo didn't look at her, he stared straight ahead as the car merged into the midnight traffic. "You have a rare gift, Ruby," he said, his voice a low vibration. "Most people in this city are made of glass. They break under a look. But you? You're forged. You stood up to me when my own captains wouldn't dare breathe in my direction." "Is this the part where you tell me how you're going to kill me?" Ruby asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "This is the part where I tell you that I have an enemy," Arturo countered. "Senator Sterling. He wants your neighborhood, and he wants my head. He's a man who only trusts people he thinks are too small to hurt him. People like a waitress from the South Side." He turned to her then, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the car feel heavy. "I need someone who can walk into his world and dismantle it from the inside. Someone he won't see coming. You play the part of my protege, you get me the leverage I need to bury him, and the Genesis Community Center is saved. All debts erased. The deed delivered to your Nana's door." Ruby felt the trap closing, but it was lined with gold. It was the impossible contract. A chance to save everything she loved by entering the very darkness she had spent her life avoiding. "And if I refuse?" "Then you go back to your bus stop," Arturo said simply. "And by Monday, the bulldozers start their engines." Ruby looked out at the passing city lights, then back at the man who held her world in his hand. "When do we start?" Arturo leaned back, the shadows reclaiming his face. "We already have." The transition from the south side to Arturo's inner sanctum was a blur of tinted glass and silent elevators. By 6 a.m., Ruby wasn't in a bedroom, she was in a laboratory of high-stakes transformation. The Iron Citadel, as Arturo's downtown penthouse was known, hummed with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. "She has the bone structure, but the hands, they tell too many stories," a woman named Madame Valeska remarked, her voice as sharp as the tailor's shears she held. She was the first of the specialists Arturo had summoned, a woman who didn't dress people, but disguised them. For the next 8 hours, Ruby was stripped of every vestige of the girl who poured cheap coffee. The cheap polyester vest was burned. The scuffed shoes were replaced by 4-inch stilettos that felt like weapons. Her hair, usually pulled back in a utilitarian puff, was sculpted into a sleek, gravity-defying crown that added 2 inches to her height and a decade to her perceived authority. But the physical change was the easiest part. The real work was the ghost protege persona. Arturo sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the dressing suite, watching through the smoke of a single, ignored cigarette. "Lower your voice," Arturo commanded when Ruby spoke. "Energy flows where attention goes. If you shout, you've already lost. Whisper, and the world leans in to hear you." He had a specialist for everything. A former intelligence officer taught her how to scan a room for exits and soft targets without moving her head. A world-class grifter showed her how to hold a champagne flute so that her thumb was always free to press a panic button. They taught her the senator's weaknesses, his ego, his love for vintage jazz, and his pathological need to be the smartest person in the room. "You aren't a waitress playing a part," Arturo said, stepping into her space as the specialists finally retreated. He adjusted the lapel of her new tailored blazer, his fingers grazing the fabric but never touching her skin, a silent acknowledgement of her earlier warning. "You are the daughter of a billionaire industrialist from the coast. You are educated, bored, and looking for an investment that the traditional banks are too cowardly to touch. You are the only person in Chicago that Senator Sterling cannot buy." Ruby looked at her reflection. The woman staring back didn't look like someone who worried about eviction. She looked like someone who signed the notices. The ghost was born, but as Ruby caught Arturo's calculating gaze in the mirror, she realized the most dangerous part of the transformation wasn't the clothes or the combat training. It was the way her own heart was starting to beat in time with the cold, rhythmic pulse of the underworld. She was no longer just protecting her home, she was learning how to hunt the people who threatened it. The transition from the South Side streets to the high-stakes theater of Arturo's world wasn't just about the clothes, it was about the mind. While the specialists had provided the armor, Arturo himself provided the edge. They stood in the war room, a soundproofed glass box overlooking the shimmering Chicago skyline, where the city's grid looked like a digital chessboard. "The senator doesn't fear a gun, Ruby," Arturo said, pacing the perimeter of the room. "He fears a mirror. He fears someone who can reflect his own greed back at him so perfectly that he forgets to look for the trap." He placed a series of photographs on the table. Senator Sterling's inner circle, his offshore accounts, and the blueprints for the redevelopment project that threatened the South Side. "Tell me what you see." Ruby didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the faces. She pointed to a photo of the senator's lead architect, a man with a nervous tic and an overly expensive watch. "He's the weak link," she said, her voice dropping into that new, rhythmic whisper Arturo had cultivated. "He's living beyond his means. He doesn't want the senator's vision, he just wants the senator's signature on his checks. If I offer him a way to get paid without the project actually breaking ground, he'll hand us the structural bypass codes." Arturo stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing with a dark, appreciative glint. "And the senator? He's a narcissist," Ruby continued, her mind moving with a speed that surprised even her. "He doesn't want to just win, he wants to be thanked for it. I won't approach him with a bribe. I'll approach him with a legacy. I'll tell him my father wants to fund a wing of the new development in his name. He'll be so busy imagining his statue in the lobby that he won't notice me downloading his server logs from his personal laptop." It wasn't just tactical, it was psychological warfare. Ruby realized that her years of navigating the complex social hierarchies of the service industry, knowing which customer was a big spender, which was a threat, and which just wanted to be heard, had been the ultimate training ground. She wasn't learning a new skill, she was weaponizing a lifetime of observation. Arturo walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The tension between them was no longer just about power, it was about a shared, lethal understanding. "You have a natural instinct for the kill, Ruby. Most people hesitate at the moment of impact. You accelerate." Ruby didn't blink. The girl who had trembled over an eviction notice was gone, replaced by a strategist who saw the world as a series of levers to be pulled. "I'm not accelerating for the thrill of it, Arturo," she reminded him, her gaze ironclad. "I'm doing it because you told me the bulldozers start on Monday. And I don't plan on letting them find anything but dirt." Arturo reached out, his hand hovering near the table, mirroring the restraint he had shown since their first night. "Then let's give the senator something to remember. Tomorrow, the ghost enters the machine." The Corinthian ballroom was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and the suffocating scent of lilies. This was the senator's territory, a place where the music was soft but the knives were sharp. Ruby stepped out of the elevator, the weight of her 4-inch heels no longer a burden but a foundation. She didn't look for the exits anymore, she looked for the prey. Beside her, Arturo looked every bit the Dark King, but tonight, he was merely the escort to the main event. He leaned in, his voice a ghost of a whisper against her ear. "Remember, Ruby. He thinks he's the hunter. Let him enjoy the dream until it becomes a nightmare." Senator Sterling stood at the center of a circle of sycophants, his smile as polished and hollow as a porcelain doll. When his eyes landed on Ruby, she saw the shift. The predatory glint of a man who thought he'd found a new trophy. He broke away from his group, weaving through the crowd with the practiced grace of a politician. "Arturo," Sterling boomed, his voice carrying the false warmth of a furnace. "I didn't know you were bringing a guest who would outshine the chandelier." "Senator," Arturo replied, his tone perfectly neutral. "Allow me to introduce Victoria Vance. Her father is looking for a legacy project in Chicago. I thought your redevelopment plan might interest her." Ruby didn't offer her hand. She merely tilted her head, her gaze cool and unimpressed. "I've seen the blueprints, Senator. They're functional. But my father doesn't invest in functional. He invests in landmarks. Something that will be standing long after the men who built it are forgotten." The bait was perfect. Sterling's chest swelled, his ego clouding the sharp instincts that had kept him in power for decades. "A woman of vision. I like that. Please, Victoria, let's find somewhere quieter to discuss how we can make this project truly legendary." As he led her toward a private alcove, Ruby felt the cold weight of the transmitter hidden in her clutch. She caught Arturo's reflection in a gilded mirror. He was watching her, a shadow among the lights, his jaw tight. She knew the stakes. One slip, one South Side inflection in her voice, and the community center would be rubble by morning. But as she sat across from the man who wanted to destroy her home, Ruby felt a strange, lethal calm. She smiled, a sharp, hungry thing. She wasn't the waitress anymore. She was the ghost, and the senator was already walking into the machine. "Tell me, Senator," she said, leaning in just enough to make him feel powerful. "Does the architect really have the structural bypass codes ready, or are we just pretending for the cameras?" The senator's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Ruby knew she had him. The hunt had officially begun. The air in the senator's private study was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive cognac, a sharp contrast to the floral mask of the ballroom outside. Ruby sat across from Sterling, her movements fluid and practiced as she navigated the digital minefield of his vanity. She had him exactly where she wanted him. Enthralled by the prospect of a legacy that would immortalize his name, his guard dropped low enough for her to begin the silent extraction of his server logs. But as the progress bar on her hidden device flickered in the shadows of her clutch, the senator's phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. He glanced at the screen, a smirk twisting his thin lips. "It seems your father isn't the only one interested in the South Side tonight, Victoria. My source tells me Arturo's grip on the North Side is slipping faster than he realizes." Ruby kept her expression frozen in a mask of polite boredom, but her pulse spiked. "Arturo Panicucci is many things, Senator, but slipping isn't a word I'd use to describe him." "Is that so?" Sterling leaned back, chuckling. "Then he's even more blind than I thought. My informant just confirmed the shipment at the docks has been rerouted. Arturo thinks he's playing chess, but his own hand is moving the pieces against him." The senator slid the phone across the desk, showing a truncated text thread. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The messages weren't from a stranger or a low-level grunt. They contained highly classified codes that only 2 people in Arturo's organization possessed. The syntax, the cold efficiency of the phrasing, it was unmistakable. It was Lorenzo, Arturo's consigliere. The man who had sat in the corner of the war room while she trained. The man who had supposedly vetted her. A cold realization washed over her, sharper than any blade. The impossible contract wasn't just a mission, it was a setup. Lorenzo wasn't just a mole, he was the architect of a coup, using Ruby as the perfect distraction to keep Arturo's eyes on the senator while the foundation of his empire was eroded from within. Every tactical move she had planned had likely been fed back to Sterling through the very man Arturo trusted most. "Is something wrong, my dear?" Sterling asked, his eyes narrowing as he caught the slight tension in her jaw. Ruby forced a slow, chilling smile, the ghost rising to the surface to shield the waitress. "Not at all, Senator. I was just thinking that legacy is a funny word. Sometimes it's built on stone, and sometimes it's built on bodies." She stood up, her device vibrating once to signal the download was complete. She had the leverage to destroy the senator, but she now carried a much deadlier secret. Arturo wasn't the hunter tonight, he was the mark, and the man holding the knife was standing right behind him. As she stepped back into the ballroom, her eyes searched the crowd for Arturo's dark silhouette. The game had changed. It was no longer about saving a community center. It was about surviving a betrayal that was already in motion. The sky over the Chicago River didn't just rain, it wept a cold, industrial sleet that blurred the line between the water and the concrete. Ruby sat in the passenger seat of Arturo's armored SUV, her silk gown hidden under a heavy tactical jacket. Beside her, Arturo was silent, his jaw set in a hard line that usually signaled a victory. But Ruby knew the truth. Every second they spent driving toward the docks was a second closer to the trap Lorenzo had laid. "Arturo, stop the car," Ruby said, her voice cutting through the hum of the heater. He didn't look at her. "We have the senator's logs, Ruby. We close the circuit at the warehouse, and we win." "Lorenzo is the mole," she snapped, the words hitting the air like a gunshot. Arturo's foot didn't move from the accelerator, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned ghost white. "I saw the texts on Sterling's phone. The rerouted shipment, the security codes, it's all him. We aren't going to a meeting. We're going to an execution." Before Arturo could respond, the world exploded in a flash of amber and shattered glass. An RPG struck the lead escort vehicle 50 yards ahead, sending a fireball into the rainy sky. Arturo slammed on the brakes, the SUV fishtailing on the slick asphalt as blacked-out vans swarmed from the shadows of the shipping containers. "Out! Now!" Arturo commanded, pulling a sleek submachine gun from beneath his seat. They scrambled into the labyrinth of the shipyard, the smell of salt and diesel filling Ruby's lungs. Bullets chewed into the metal crates around them, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed fire echoing in the narrow corridors. Arturo moved with the grace of a predator, but even he was being hemmed in. Lorenzo's men knew his tactical playbook by heart. They were flushing him toward the water. "They expect you to fight like a soldier, Arturo," Ruby hissed, pulling him behind a stack of rusted pallets. "But they don't know how to fight a ghost." She didn't reach for a gun. Instead, she grabbed a flare from an emergency box on the side of a crane and pulled a heavy chain from a nearby winch. She remembered the South Side, how to lead a bully into a dark alleyway where the numbers didn't matter. "When I kill the lights, move toward the crane," she whispered. Ruby didn't use a trigger, she used the environment. She swung the heavy chain into the main junction box of the pier, sending a cascade of blue sparks into the pouring rain. The entire dock plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. In the confusion, the mercenaries' night vision goggles flared with static. Ruby popped the flare and threw it into a pool of leaked gasoline 20 yards away, creating a wall of fire that masked their escape. "This way," she urged, leading Arturo through a drainage crawlspace she'd spotted earlier, a path too small and too filthy for a man of his status to ever consider. As they huddled in the dark, the sound of Lorenzo's frustrated shouts fading into the rain, Arturo looked at Ruby. For the first time, the calculation was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, jagged respect. "You didn't just save my life, Ruby." "I told you," she whispered, her finger pointed at his chest just as it had been that first night. "Touch me again and I'll break you. I didn't say I'd let anyone else do it." The rain had turned the Chicago skyline into a blurred reflection of charcoal and neon, but inside the cramped, dimly lit basement of a South Side boxing gym, the air was electric with a different kind of storm. Arturo sat on a folding chair, his shoulder bandaged where a graze had ruined his $1,000 suit, watching the woman he had once dismissed as just a waitress. Ruby didn't look like a waitress anymore. She stood over a map of the city spread across a heavy equipment crate, her silhouette sharp against the flickering overhead light. 6 of Arturo's most loyal soldiers, men who had spent their lives following the King of the North Side, stood in a semicircle around her. They were hesitant, their eyes flickering toward Arturo for a signal, but he remained silent. He wasn't the one holding the room. Ruby was. "Lorenzo expects you to hit the front gates of his estate with everything you've got," Ruby said, her voice a low, steady hum that commanded the silence. "He's waiting for a Mafia war. But we're not giving him one. We're giving him a scandal." She tapped a finger on the blueprints of Senator Sterling's private gala at the Lakefront Conservatory. "The senator is hosting his final fundraiser tonight. Lorenzo will be there to finalize the deed transfer for the South Side blocks. They think the docks were the end of us. They think they're celebrating a funeral." She looked up, her eyes locking onto the lead soldier, a man twice her size. "We don't go in with guns drawn. We go in with the server logs I pulled from the senator's study. While you neutralize Lorenzo's perimeter team using the drainage routes I showed you, I'm going straight to the podium. I'm going to broadcast the senator's legacy. The bribes, the bypass codes, and the recorded conversations with Lorenzo, to every donor and news camera in that room. It's a suicide mission," the soldier grunted. "It's a queen's gambit," Ruby countered, her chin tilting upward. "I'm the piece they think is a pawn. They'll let me get close because they think I'm still the ghost protege looking for a way out. By the time they realize I'm the one holding the detonator to their reputations, it'll be too late." Arturo stood up then, the shadows retreating from his face as he walked toward her. The room held its breath. He didn't take the map. He didn't offer a correction. He simply handed her his own signet ring, the symbol of the Panicucci authority. "The North Side follows the crown," Arturo whispered, his voice thick with a dark, newfound pride. "Tonight, the crown belongs to you." Ruby took the ring, sliding it onto her thumb. The weight of it was cold, but her blood was fire. She looked at the men, her expression unshakable. "Armor up. We have a neighborhood to save, and 2 monsters to bury." The morning sun over the South Side didn't look like charcoal today, it looked like burnished gold. Ruby C. Adams stood on the sidewalk in front of the Genesis Community Center, watching as a group of local teenagers painted a vibrant new mural over the old, chipped brick. The final notice that had once threatened to haunt her dreams was gone, replaced by a deed stamped with the official seal of the city, a gift from a disgraced senator who was currently trading his bespoke suits for a prison jumpsuit. The scandal at the conservatory had been the final blow. By the time the news cameras had finished broadcasting Ruby's evidence, Sterling's political career was a smoking crater, and Lorenzo's shadow empire had collapsed under the weight of his own treachery. The ghost had finished her job, but as Ruby watched the kids laughing in the safety of the center, she realized she couldn't just go back to being the girl who disappeared into the background. A familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine a low, respectful purr. Arturo Panicucci stepped out, but he wasn't the same man who had snapped his fingers at her weeks ago. He looked at the community center, then at the neighborhood, and finally at Ruby. There was no arrogance in his stance, only a quiet, deep-seated recognition of a power that matched his own. "Nana Rose says the new basketball court is being delivered on Tuesday," Arturo said, walking up to stand beside her. She also mentioned you're a terrible cook, but a hell of a negotiator. Ruby laughed, a genuine sound that felt light in her chest. She's not wrong about either. The debt is paid, Arturo. The contract is over. I'm going back to work. I know, Arturo said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, velvet box. He didn't offer a ring this time. He opened it to reveal a key, not to a house, but to the executive suite of a new development firm he was launching, one focused on the very neighborhoods men like Sterling had tried to erase. But you're not going back to the Gilded Lily. I don't need a waitress, Ruby. I don't even need a protégé anymore. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, serious tone they had shared in the trenches of the war. The North Side is changing. I've spent my life taking things, but you taught me how to save them. I'm offering you a seat at the table. Equal shares. Equal voice. We run the city together, not as boss and servant, but as partners. Ruby looked at the key, then at the center, and finally at the man who had seen her fire when the rest of the world only saw her uniform. She reached out and took the key, her fingers brushing his with a spark of mutual respect. I have one condition, Ruby said, her eyes flashing with that familiar, fearless defiance. Arturo smirked, inclined his head. Only one? We start by buying Nana Rose a new kitchen. And if you ever snap your fingers at a waitress in my presence again. I know, Arturo finished for her, a dark, fond smile touching his lips. You'll break me. Exactly, Ruby whispered. And as they walked toward the car to begin their new reign, the city finally felt like it belonged to them both.